It's one of those few moments in the life of the Catholic Church when the whole world is watching. The papal apartment is empty, the Sistine Chapel is being prepared, and the Cardinals are discussing the state of the Church and the profile of the next Pope. Those discussions are completely private. The Cardinals have even taken an oath not to share any information about the conclave and the candidates they're considering. But some journalists have been in Rome long enough to understand the different forces at work. They know the structures, the formulas, the rituals, but most importantly, they know the human beings involved. And in times like these, their perspective becomes invaluable. One of these journalists is Gerry O'Connell. Born in Ireland and a graduate of Cambridge University, he's been reporting on Vatican affairs since 1985. I had the chance to sit down with him recently for an interview. The Cardinals are discussing very serious issues in the life of the Church today here in Rome. One of those issues is the question of governance here at the Vatican. Can you frame that question for us? When the Cardinals say we have questions or we have concerns about governance here, what do they mean?
Well, first of all, the Vatican, like any government, the Pope, like any head of state, has a civil service. In the Vatican here, a civil service with different departments, about 1,000 people working in them. And the question is that this has been a dysfunctional government in the past period, especially under Benedict XVI, but also previously. John Paul II had his own system of government, and I'll speak about that in a second. But really, it's always been a question, right back to Paul VI. Paul VI was elected during the Second Vatican Council in 1963. He had worked all his life inside in the Vatican. And one of his major tasks, as he saw it in terms of the central government of the Church, was to change the internal structure. John Paul II also tried to change the internal structure. But he was an outsider. He came from Poland, he'd never worked in the Vatican, and so he developed his own particular system of government. He placed Poles, Polish prelates, Polish priests in every department of the Vatican. And so they responded directly to his private secretary. So he had a good idea of what was happening. So he had a parallel system of government in a sense. You had the official structure and then you had the Polish overlay. When Ratzinger became Pope, when he was elected in 2005, he had said several years before he was elected, he said, "I have no talent for sport, no talent for organization, no talent for administration." It was known when he was Archbishop of Munich that he delegated much of the government to his number two. When he was in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith for more than 20 years, he also delegated all the personnel administration questions to his number two. When he became Pope, he did the same. He delegated to his Secretary of State. The problem was the Secretary of State did not have great talent for government either. And so you had, in the 2005 conclave, after John Paul II, before Ratzinger was elected, the Cardinals had identified one problem. You must have coordination and communication within the different departments of the Roman Curia, the Vatican Civil Service. Mm-hmm. This, however, did not happen in the 8 years of the pontificate of Benedict XVI. And so you had many problems. And they culminated with the leaks, the Vatileaks, the leaking of the confidential documents from the Pope's own apartment. And this reflected the internal problems, tensions, accusations of corruption, many other problems. Now, obviously, the Catholic Church, the central government, is like any central government. While it's based on faith and belief, it's men who are running it. I remember when an African cardinal said to me, if God wanted a perfect central government, he would have appointed angels, not men. So when you have men, you have the dynamics in any organization, and you have tensions, you have different visions, but it's a question of how you harmonize, how you bring these together. Every government in any country has, every prime minister has the same problems. How does he harmonize the different points of view, the different tensions? And so you have this in the Catholic Church too.
You mentioned that at the conclave or pre-conclave meetings in 2005, one of the concerns was communication between different departments.
And coordination.
And coordination here at the Vatican. And that, from speaking to the Cardinals here in 2013, a lot of them have the same question. What has happened over the last 8 years? I mean, what's the feeling amongst the Cardinals? They must be aware, or some of them must be aware, that this is a very similar question that they were dealing with 8 years ago. Is it the same question today?
Well, the situation has deteriorated because you've had these confidential leaks from the papal apartment of documents. You've had the exposure in the public domain of real clashes and contrasts and accusations of corruption. So the situation is disturbing. So that a bishop, for example, in any part of Canada, he writes a letter to the Pope. Is he sure that that letter will not end up in the Italian media some weeks later? A nuncio, the Vatican's ambassador in I don't know, Guatemala, sends a letter to the Pope. Is he sure that the confidential text will not appear? So this has touched the heart of government, the leaks, and also the exposure of tensions. Now, many people say this has been an Italian problem because all the actors have been mainly Italian. But there is real concern among the cardinals. They say, if we have a malfunctioning, dysfunctional central government, this is going to impact on the church in the far distant lands. I was in China last year, and I met people there, and they said, well, bishops here, they are worried about sending a letter to Rome because Beijing will know in a week. This is what they fear. It's clear the cardinals are well aware that something is not functioning. Something is functioning very badly. In these meetings before the conclave, they want to get to the bottom of this. What exactly is the situation inside? There's a certain demoralization among the many good people who are working there. But somehow there seems to be lack of direction, seems to be a lack of chain of command. So the cardinal said, this won't do. We want to know exactly what is the situation, and secondly, we want to know, once we've identified what the problem is, we want to see who is the most suitable man to appoint as Pope, to elect as Pope, to deal with this situation. Because the dysfunction of the central government of the Church impacts on the whole of the Church worldwide. And also on its relations with governments. Because if governments are having confidential relations with the Vatican and having their ambassadors sent, just as happened with the Wikileaks, you have the same problem of confidence and trust.
Talk a little bit more about that, because most people don't realize that the Catholic Church is a political entity and carries political weight as a state. So when these kinds of questions are being asked, how does that affect the Church's relation, as you said, to other nation states, given many of the problems, many of the crises, many of the situations around the world?
Well, the Catholic Church is an international body. It has, as the Vatican, the Holy See, which is the central government of the Catholic Church, it has relations with more than 170 states. It has diplomatic relations. So these countries have ambassadors here to the Holy See, to the Vatican, and the Vatican has nuncios, ambassadors to these countries. And you have interchange at governmental level between governments and the Holy See. And so it's very important that a government, you can think of situations like the Palestinian-Israeli question, you can think of situations today like in Syria, or you can think of Nigeria, or you can think of maybe some relations with Pakistan, or with China. And if the confidential communications between the central government of one of these countries and the Holy See becomes a matter of public disclosure, you cannot really conduct business.
Right. Talk about the significance of Pope Benedict's resignation in all of this. He threw everybody for a loop. Nobody was expecting him to make this decision. How does that fit in to this whole picture that you're painting for us?
Well, he'd obviously had the idea in his mind for a long time, because I remember in 2002, 2003, when people asked him, then Cardinal Ratzinger, should John Paul II resign when he was very ill? He said, no, he should not resign, but I can see a future pope might resign for some reason. And then in the interview book in 2010, he spoke personally about the possibility of resignation. But this is really a break with a 600-year-old tradition that the Pope didn't resign. It's an earthquake into the system. But it has enormous significance, because it means now that, for example, the Cardinals, when they go to elect the next Pope, they have the possibility of deciding. We can elect an older man because we know that he will not feel obliged to have this job for life. We can equally elect a younger man for on the same rationale. But it went beyond that. It gave a lesson to people both in religious life and in state life, that holding on to positions of power, prestige, and influence is not really what the center of human life is about. And in this respect, Benedict has given a lesson, first of all to the College of Cardinals, the bishops of the Catholic Church, the leaders in the Church, but also in the wider world, that one has to somehow understand that when one is in a position of responsibility and power, it is a service to the Church or to the community. And one must not consider this as one's own personal, private privilege, status, power.
The question of governance and the question of Benedict's resignation are certainly not the only questions that are being raised. What are some of the other big topics that are on the agenda among the cardinals at this time?
I think the first one is, of course, this is the Catholic Church. Its mission is to communicate the gospel of Christ, the message of Christ to the world. You have 60% of the world's population living in Asia. Today you have 3% of the Asian population are Christian, 2% are Catholic. So it's a major challenge. How do you communicate the good news of Jesus Christ to the people of Asia? You have, on the other side, you have in the continent of Africa, you have the explosion of Christianity, many vocations, many people joining the Christian church. And so there you have a question of growth. In the West, you have a problem of decline, where many people are abandoning the faith or not seeing any real reason for joining a church or belonging to a church. And there the problem is, how do you revive the faith? How do you give people new confidence in the church? And this goes back also to the question of governance, because if people do not have faith in the central governments, they're not going to have faith much in the local church. So that's one big area, the question of how do you bring the good news to people? The second question is, of course, the relations between religions in the world. 1 in 3 people in the world are Christian. 1 in 6 is a Muslim. 1 in 8 is a Hindu. So the question of the interrelations between religions, and then there are Buddhists. How do you relate to the other religions? This is a big question for the cardinals as they meet, but for the future Pope. How does the Catholic Church relate to the other religions? The essence of true religion is to bring peace and harmony between people and to construct a more human society. The new Pope will have to follow this line, I think. Then there's the question of the dialogue with the cultures of the world, because there are different cultures, and obviously this was one of the areas that Benedict XVI, he tried to bring out very clearly the possibility that there was no contrast between faith and reason, that you can find harmony, that they complement each other. But it's a big question, because we've got a whole youth culture, for example, in North America, different in Africa, of course, different in Latin America. But how do you relate to these cultures? And so the question is, how do you reach out to the young people also? I remember I was with John Paul II when he came to Canada, reaching out to the young people. In his pontificate, John Paul II met, I calculated, 25 million young people in different parts of the world. Benedict followed this. In a way, he looked like an orphan. But the young people adopted him, and then he became like their grandfather, whom they related. And so when he went to Sydney, and when he went to Madrid, and at the end he was connecting with these young people. And this is very important, that the future Pope can continue this. And the Cardinals are very well aware of this, because they're mostly older men. And in fact, in history, a Pope has tended to be older. In the last 400 years, only 20 popes have been under the age of 58. It's a question of mindset, a way of being open. And I think the Cardinals I've spoken to, they're conscious that the problem of the central government of the Church is a key issue. But they're also very conscious that they must find a candidate who can connect with the ordinary people on the street, and especially with the younger generations, because the younger generations are the future of the world. You're saying what are the problems they're discussing. They're also looking at who is the man of faith, the man of God, who really communicates God. I remember traveling with John Paul II and feeling, when we used to meet him on the flights, you felt somehow you were meeting a man who was bridging two worlds, this world and the next, and you had this sensation meeting him. And then you've seen at the end of Benedict's reign how he's emerged really as a religious leader, as a man of faith, as a man of God. This has been, I think, what the Cardinals will also be looking for. Who among them can really communicate that spiritual sense, spiritual vision to the world?
This is one of those very unique moments when the world's eyes are on Rome, are looking at the Vatican. And journalists and media that would otherwise not be interested in the day-to-day dealings and functioning of the Catholic Church are interested. As someone who's covered the Vatican for a long time, how do you assess the secular media's portrayal of what's going on here these days?
It shows that there's, first of all, an interest in the Vatican, in the Pope, in religion in the world. There's something that attracts. Of course, the motives may be different, but everybody is conscious that the Pope is a very significant figure in the world. So it means that somehow people have beyond their material and political interest, there is this religious angle. They don't quite understand it. Many journalists, colleagues have been parachuted in without having a little idea of this subject. And it's difficult for them to understand. It's difficult for them to report because they don't have much time to put together a story. Their editors are pushing, they want 1 page, 2 page, or they want news clips. And so I think they struggle. So I have sympathy for many people who come in from the outside. Understanding the Vatican is already a complex thing even for many Catholics, even bishops. So imagine what it is for a secular journalist who comes in from a paper in some country and has never understood what this situation is. They hear about of course, bad news travels quickly, and the scandals and the intrigue and the backstabbing and whatever else has been reported is what makes news headlines. But also there is this incredible interest in the personalities. Latin American, Canadian, possible Italian, possible Asian Pope. It challenges the mind, it sparks a lot of interest. And especially the Asian Pope, I've seen there's a phenomenal interest in the possibility that a Pope might come from that part of the world where there are so few Christians and where there's the majority of humanity. And then in Latin America, I know that there is great interest because there you have the majority of the world's Catholics. And one cardinal said to me, I can foresee in the next 50 to 100 years we'll have many popes from South America. So there is this interest in the man who is a spiritual leader. And remember the generations who are growing up now, they grew up with John Paul II. and they saw him kind of walk tall in the world stage. But also we saw the tremendous outpouring at his death, of the flow of people, and it's never been a media event so covered in world history. And now we see the phenomenal interest that Benedict has sent a shockwave into the whole of the international scene. The consequence is you have more than 5,000 journalists here. So there is from 62 countries. So this is significant. So I have sympathy of those who are trying to cover it in short time when you need a long time experience to understand what is going on.
I have one final question for you. Given where we're at now, before the conclave starts, have the Cardinals narrowed their decision at all? Or do you, from an insider's perspective, do you still think that the field is wide open?
Well, I've spoken to Cardinals from all the continents in these past 10 days. And I've come to the conclusion that they are still in the information gathering, information sharing phase. They have identified a number of candidates, but they haven't really concluded that this is the obvious candidate. So I think it is still open. Of course, there are some front runners, but none with such a head start. Among the front runners, there's of course Cardinal Ouellet of Canada, but none has really stretched a lead to make him the one that is most likely to pull all the votes.
What would it take for you to be surprised on the day that the Pope walks out on the balcony? Because it seems like there's still a lot of questions.
I think if they went to Asia for the Pope, that would surprise me. I think if they
Is it impossible?
It's not impossible. I think it's unlikely, but I think it's more likely they will cross the Atlantic.
Thank you very much, Gerry.
Thank you.